Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my NACL playoffs. Round number 1, round number 2, overview and analysis video. It's the first weekend done and dusted already in the playoffs for the NACL. I'm excited to finally be getting into some playoff coverage somewhere around the world. This is actually the first playoff series we will cover in the spring split on this channel, so I'm very excited to go over all of it. Of course, like I said, the first weekend consisted of upper bracket round number 1 and upper bracket round number 2. We're going to cover all 4 of the best of 3s in today's video. We're not even at the best of 5 stage yet. We will be getting there as we get into later weekends, but for now, still in the best of 3, so pretty similar to the regular season in terms of the format, but definitely not in terms of the stakes. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect to happen in these games, and did they surprise you? I know I was at least a little surprised by the outcomes of some of these series, but we'll talk about that as we continue to go along. Let's go ahead and get into it, though. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and this is typically where I would say I'm giving a player of the week and a dud of the week, but I don't really do that for playoffs. We're just going to be looking at the bracket and kind of talking about where things are heading into the second weekend at the end of the video. So I hope you guys are excited. I know I am, but without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the content itself. Like I said, there's going to be 4 playoff series that we are covering to kick off our time here in the NACL, and that starts with round 1, of course. There's no other place to begin in terms of how this goes. Just as a reminder for how the format ends up breaking down, the top 2 seeds get a bye into round number 2, no matter what. We'll talk about them a bit later, but then it's 3 versus 6 and 4 versus 5 in round 1. Winners move on to round 2 to take on the 1 and 2 seeds, and then the losers go down into the lower bracket to play each other, and the lower bracket is basically a gauntlet style format. We're seeing a lot of these across the world in terms of how, a lot of these leagues and regions want to do their playoffs. The LCK very notoriously kind of going to a system like this, but if you lose, if you expend your extra life, especially early on in the tournament, it exponentially increases the amount of games and series you'll need to play in order to even get to top 3 or top 2 or top 1 if you wanted to get there. So you do not want to lose in round number 1, and that transitions us very nicely into our first series that we are going to talk about, our 3 versus 6 matchup. Near Airport taking on Winthrop University, and Winthrop is going to pick up the 2-1 series win in what most would consider a pretty big upset. I certainly would consider it an upset, although I can understand the idea behind not saying that because Winthrop actually just beat Near Airport last week as well at the end of the regular season, and so to see them come out and be able to pick up the victory here against a Near Airport team that's even weaker in terms of the roster that they're putting out with no Biofrost in the support position, it shouldn't really be all that surprising. I think the most fun and interesting thing here is that basically every single one of Winthrop's wins was a come from behind win, a comeback, if you will, and a lot of that has to do with just the consistency of their bot lane and their ability to play out these team fights really well in the back half of these games. But for Near Airport, this is a very detrimental loss. Like, I don't want to undersell how important it is to win in round number 1. Now they go down into lower bracket round 1. They can't lose again the rest of the tournament. They've expended their extra life, and now they have to play, again, exponentially more series than almost anybody else in the playoffs. So it'll be good experience for them, but they've got to turn around their form because there's a lot that we can complain about from them in this series. But starting with Winthrop, as we always do here, player of the series to me is very obviously going to go to Mobility in the bot lane. He just straight up was the better AD carry in this series. I don't even think it's really all that up for debate. You can kind of give Doublelift a lot of credit in a couple of different areas, especially for his mid-game skirmishing. I think he did really well in that regard. This is one of the few series where they actually were playing for him. Look at this draft in game number 3. This is a Tristana game. If Tristana's not fed, you can't win. Like, that's all your damage. Victor obviously can do quite a bit for Pobelter, and he's very good on champions like that, but you've got your Star Spica on Ivern trying to facilitate TF Blade on Cassante in the top lane. Kelpo, being there to step up and, try and create for Doublelift. But this is really a Tristana comp, and at the end of the day, Mobility was more useful on the Jhin than Doublelift was on the Tristana in the back half of these fights, and that was the big separator that got Winthrop over the edge, and that's a big plus to Mobility. We've talked about it over and over again on this channel when it comes to Winthrop, but the reason they're able to upset and surprise a lot of these teams like Near Airport or even like Blue Water earlier on in the split is because if their bot lane clicks, if they're able to get gigantic leads and play well in the late game, they're one of the scariest bot lanes in the entire league. The talent level of Mobility in Only 35 is incredibly high. Mobility is one of the brightest mechanical prospects I would say that we have here in North America. Of course, Only 35 has international experience from his time in Turkey, so you're looking at two players that definitely can step up and really perform in the right circumstance, and that's exactly what this was, and both times these teams have played, Mobility has been the better AD carry, which is really interesting to me, so excited to see that continue to grow. Mobility is a very, very bright player. It was him and Shogo, obviously, that are always going to be compared as the two C-Lol AD carries that kind of came into the Tier 2 system at the same time, and have always been big rivals in Tier 3 and all of that stuff, but Mobility right now, at least from a Tier 2 perspective, has been the one to really emerge as a potential future star. Again, credit to Only 35. I thought he did a great job this series. He very much gapped Kelpo on the other side of this in terms of the creation, especially in the back half of these games, the team fighting stage. He was not overstaying his welcome, not overstepping, just putting himself in good positions. I also want to give a big shout out to Denethor on the top side. TF Blade really struggled the last time these two played against each other. Denethor was just way better in terms of, you know, getting his counter pick and capitalizing on it in the 1v1, and that happened again here in game number 3, even really just throughout the rest of this series. Like, Denethor was the better top laner by a pretty consistent margin, and the thing we talked about in the preseason that could potentially hold Near Airport back is TF Blade on the top side, the one player here without a real large bevy of competitive experience, and at least, again, in this series, if Denethor is just going to be able to outplay TF Blade and be a better top laner than him, that makes things more difficult, because again, Mobility is going to step up, Only 35 is going to step up. If you also have Denethor winning on the top side, even if you have Spica and Pobelter on something aggressive that can win in the middle of the map, it doesn't end up really mattering in the end, which is really unfortunate for Near Airport. And, you know, Wilson and Sword certainly didn't have bad series. I thought Wilson actually played really well here going into Spica. He was more impactful in the back half of these games, which I think is really difficult to do against a player in Spica who is very consistent as a team fighter. Sword was okay. I'm certainly not trying to discredit what Sword was. I think he's been pretty solid across this split, one of the more impressive mid laners for me in the NACL, but Pobelter was probably a tad bit better in terms of what he was able to create. That being said, again, Mobility was the main character. Sword wasn't receiving nearly as many resources, and Denethor was also winning on the top side. This team understood their win conditions well, and even if they would drop in gold early, they understood their win conditions, and they knew they could outplay Near Airport in the back half of these games, which is such a confident approach, and I'm really happy to see it from them. And then for Near Airport on the other side, so much went wrong for them in this series. First and foremost, we have to point out that Biofrost is not here, that Kelpo is starting in the support position. When you're talking about, you know, Kelpo having some time on Near Airport, he got one series earlier this split alongside Sushi, and that really worked. That bot lane actually looked kind of like an upgrade. I'm not going to say they were an upgrade, but a lot of that to me was just how good Sushi was, and I think how mechanically talented he is as a player. I think Kelpo's problems, especially in such a high-pressure scenario, kind of came out in this one, and he's going to get dud of the series for me. That Milio game in game number 1 was not particularly good. I think he was mispositioned in a lot of those fights and really kind of led Double Lift into some bad situations, and then he was not good at all on the Leona, in my opinion, in game number 3. Now, that's not to say the rest of this team doesn't deserve some criticism, because I'm definitely going to dish it out, but Kelpo to me was the dud of the series in terms of just who was the least valuable. I think you could honestly, though, make an argument that it's Double Lift or TF Blade. I think both of them kind of underperformed in this series. Double Lift was mega fed in both games that they really needed to win, specifically in game number 3, and then just got outplayed. Like, there's nothing else left to say. This guy was like 11, 2, and 10 on Tristana, and then just jumped in and died. Like, you can't really get away with that. It's not really something that is a good sign for a player like Double Lift, especially because I think the narrative for me so far for Near Airport has been, okay, Spica and Pobelter have been excellent. Pobelter was my MVP in the regular season in terms of just most valuable player, even if you don't want to consider him the most valuable prospect, and this team hasn't really played for bot lane. Double Lift has not been a main character. He's definitely been more weak side bot throughout a lot of this year, but they are investing into him in a very big game number 3, and it does not come up clutch. He does not play well in the back half of the game. It really makes you question whether or not this team is going to be able to play for Double Lift in that same kind of way. I think that's probably an overreaction. I certainly think he's good enough. Like we've seen throughout this split, he's really been good in that role, but there's a reason they won the game he was on Ashe, and they lost the game he was on, Tristana and Lucian. Not to say that his Tristana has been bad. It's been unbeaten before this series, but it's just something to keep in mind when you're starting to get closer and closer to the top of the standings here. And then Obviously, more concerningly, TF Blade was just not very good, and I think that's something that's probably going to continue. I don't really believe in TF Blade as an upper-tier top laner at the NACL level. I think he's average at this level, which is good enough for you to be able to win with, but if Denethor is outplaying you consistently in the matchups against him, that's really not a good sign. Pobelter was the best player on this team, as he almost always is for Near Airport, but he also isn't very aggressive, and so it's just really difficult for him to, salvage a game that's kind of going wrong elsewhere, and Spica was honestly out-jungled in this series. I think you can make an argument that that's not the case, and that part of it was just his laners not taking advantage of the resources he created, but Wilson was more valuable, in my opinion, in the back half of this series. So a couple of problems for Near Airport, and it puts them down into the lower bracket. Like I already said, this is a gigantic loss for them. They now have to run the gauntlet to even try and get to top 3, which they already were expected to do. And then for Winthrop on the other side, this is a massive win. This moves them into round 2, where they'll take on Luminosity. Obviously, that's another uphill battle. They're even bigger underdogs against Luminosity than they were against Near Airport, but if they can knock off this team twice, who's to say they can't do another? But then moving on to our second round 1 series, and this is the one that I think more people were kind of considering to be up in the air. Ironically enough, even though the upset occurred, it was Conviction taking on CCG Esports. And Conviction, once again, is going to pick up another victory. They beat CCG to confirm their spot at number 4 in the playoffs and put CCG at number 5, and they once again come out and pick up another victory here in the playoffs. This is a bit of a ring the bell moment, I would say, for the channel. I have consistently put Conviction over CCG throughout the entirety of the regular season. There was no point outside of, the preseason where Conviction was lower than CCG for me. After week number 1, Conviction was at 4 and CCG was at 5 in my power rankings. I didn't really see that anywhere else, and I'm glad to know that I kind of saw something in this team that others maybe were underestimating, or maybe I was just a little bit lower on CCG, which I think I kind of am in terms of what they are as a roster. But Conviction, let's talk about what they're doing right, because they do have a lot of really good things going for them, and especially with a team like Near Airport struggling a lot more now than maybe they did, just a couple of weeks ago. Who's to say this isn't a top 3 team in the NACL right now? I think that that's actually a possibility for Conviction, which is awesome to be able to say. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Darkwings in the mid lane. He's been unreal over the past month in particular. And that's just so fun to see. This is a player that I've obviously hyped up at times in the past. I've also kind of talked about the inconsistencies in the past. Darkwings has always been a feast or famine mid laner, even going back to when we were talking about him in like 2022, 2023 as a player. It's just like, okay, well, the great games look amazing, but the bad games look kind of bad. And it's very, concerning to see that it's such a polarizing difference between what it looks like when it works and what it doesn't. But I'm telling you, man, over the past month or so, has this guy not been like a top 2 mid laner in the NACL? Has he not been better than players like Insanity? Like, it's actually absurd just how well he's playing at the current moment, the form that he's been in. And again, I want to reiterate a point that I've said in a couple of other regions, but I think is still relevant, especially for NACL. Play what you are good at. Like, it really is that simple. Sometimes we see a lot of players trying to adapt to this meta where they play a lot of roaming picks, things like Talia and Ryze and Galio that have become a lot more popular, or even Annie, to establish lane pressure. You see a lot more aggressive picks, things like Yone, things like Aurora that are getting brought out a bit more than maybe these players are comfortable with, and control mages are kind of being put on the side. Well, if you're really good at control mages, as it turns out, you can very much still win on this. It's a life lesson that I've been giving to players like Rookie over in the LPL, where it's just like, please pick the stuff that you actually perform well on. And Darkwings has really kind of taken that to heart. He's just playing the things that he's always been known for. He's always been a really great control mage player. Syndra has always been his champion, at least in terms of what I, think of when I think of him from a tier 2 perspective, even from a C-Lol and tier 3 perspective. Like, it's always been Syndra, and you know what? He pulls it out in a very important game number 3, and he pops off on it in the back half of the game. I think for the most part, though, Darkwings is getting player of the series because he was the most consistent piece across the entire series. He was awesome in game number 1. I want to give him a big shout out for that Orianna game. I think if you were just looking at game 3, Chrome probably gets player of the series here because he was super influential on the Callista, very much outplayed Array in terms of how things went, even Breezy in the bot lane, which has been CCG's strength. But Darkwings across all 3 games to me was definitely the biggest positive because he still was strong in game 2, the one player on the team that didn't get run over in that second game, and he was great in game 1. He was really solid in the back half of game number 3. It all just was clicking for him, and again, he's been on fire as of late. He is a big reason why I feel so good about this team at the moment. But like I said, I do want to give a big shout out to Chrome and Manui, who get better game over game over game. I know I've hyped up, both of these players quite a bit in the past as AD carries, and now obviously Manui role swapping to support, but Chrome is a really talented ADC, and he showed that in Game 3, probably the player of the game for the third and final game in this series, and I know we all had high expectations for him, especially because him and Darkwings, coming back together as the carry duo that, dominated on Slew for a bit of time, and, obviously had some time in the NACL last year, had a whole split in summer, but Chrome has continued to step up. I'm not going to say he's been quite as much of a hard carry as he was in 2024, but he's still been really good, and I think a big reason for that is because the rest of the team is stepping up more than they did in 2024. So big credit to Chrome. I thought he was awesome in this series. Manui, like the progression, the evolution of his game, it's just so clear to see the difference between where he was at in the open qualifier tournament when this team got into the NACL versus now. It's night and day. He's genuinely becoming one of the best supports in Tier 2. It's really fun to watch. He outplayed Breezy, who was my all-pro selection in the regular season in the support position. Really, really great from him. Hoarder was unstoppable on that Olaf, like very much lived up to the power fantasy of that champion. Kisno was very good on the Poppy in game number 3. Conviction just looked better, and I think that's the most encouraging trait. And then for CCG on the other side, like I can't really say I'm surprised by this. I've been a little bit critical of a couple of the players on this team, most specifically Aljun in the mid lane. I've just really not loved how he's played in a lot of their losses. That being said, he was the best player on the Rift for CCG here today. He was definitely not the issue. And when you look at their Game 2 draft, this is the kind of stuff that they were succeeding on in the regular season, specifically things like Dr. Mundo Jungle that I think Dardoch is very good at and very comfortable on. Crimson looked phenomenal on Mbessa in game number 2. I think that was a big positive. And, Aljun was very good on the Annie. It's just a lot of comfort coming in from these players. And then when they're taken off of that, going into the rest of Fearless, I do think things look worse. And for me, dud of the series is going to go to Array. And you might not necessarily agree with that. I kind of can get behind, maybe pushing back on that a little bit. But for me, Array was easily the worst player in game number 3. And that was really the only game where it felt like CCG was completely out of it. They were super close in game number 1. And then game 2 was kind of a blowout in their favor. They were the better team by a considerable margin. Game 3, really the only game where it felt like they fell behind and, had a lot of mistakes. And the Varus was just completely irrelevant in that game. Not only dying 2v2 in the bot lane to the Kalista Renata, but also just getting run down by the Olaf and not really being able to do anything in the back half of the game. Array not being relevant was a big factor in CCG not being able to win this game, and that's the thing, right? You look at this bot lane, they've been the strength of this team. I love how Dardoch's been playing. I think he's been in better form than he gets credit for. Crimson's been fine on the top side, and, mid lane's very good when they go up against mid laners that are near the bottom of the standings, maybe not so much near the top of the standings, but if Array and Breezy are going to be losing in the bot lane, specifically to Chrome and Manui, who are very good, it's really difficult to overcome that. I know we just talked about this with Winthrop versus Near Airport, but it's really important for these teams that rely on their bot lane to actively get pressure early game, and if they don't, it's really simple. It's like a flowchart. They just aren't able to win the game from that point, and that was unfortunately the case for CCG in this one. So obvious things they need to fix, but at the end of the day, they're not out of the tournament or anything like that. They're just going down into the lower bracket, but now they've got to go up against Near Airport. That's a really fun matchup. We're going to preview it at the end of today's video when we talk about the bracket itself, but congratulations to Conviction. We're going to talk about them in just a second because they're moving on to round number 2, and they're going to be our first matchup of round number 2. It does not get easier from here. They have to take on DarkZero, and a lot of people consider them, one of, if not the best team in the NACL, even with some of the roster changes, and so, Conviction's got to keep their momentum up, but honestly, who's to say this isn't a top 3 team right now in the NACL? But now that we are done with round number 1, it's time to get into our upper bracket round number 2. Remember, this is the beginning of the playoffs for the top 2 seeds from the regular season, and they will be taking on the winners that we already talked about, and that means a back-to-back series coverage here for one of these teams, as we saw DarkZero Dragonsteel taking on Conviction. And DarkZero is going to pick up the 2-0 victory, although definitely a lot more contentious than maybe just a regular 2-0 would indicate. This was a pretty back-and-forth series, all things considered. Conviction was never in the driver's seat, I wouldn't say. Like, it never was like, oh, Conviction has the lead and DarkZero has to come back. It was more so, okay, they're staying in it, they're staying relevant, they're able to pull back some gold. All of these fights are being won by Dragonsteel, but it's kind of more, oh, we got 4 and they got 3, right? Like, it's not quite as dominant of a victory as maybe a 2-0 would indicate, but it's still a very nice pickup for DarkZero. And honestly, the conversation around this team and around this org right now is, can they survive without Yuji? Of course, Yuji picked up by Team Liquid in the LTA. He's gonna, be covered in tomorrow's video when we talk about what happened in the final week of the quote-unquote regular season, the placements part of the regular season. But for DarkZero, it's like, can they survive with Shimmer coming in as their starting jungler? Because that was a big question mark. Shimmer is obviously one of the least established players in the entire league in terms of what he's done at the tier 2. He's done nothing at the tier 2 level, but he's also not even been a super prevalent player at the tier 3 level. He's been, decent there, but he's not been on top tier 3 teams, even like, some of the other players across the Rift here, like Hoarder or, Kizno, that have obviously been super successful there. So it's obviously kind of a, okay, well, what are you going to get out of Shimmer? It's very much a wait-and-see approach. For now, it's looked pretty darn good. I think Shimmer's been awesome in the 2 series that he's played so far at the Tier 2 level, but he also still gets to play with one of the best teams in the entire league, and I think that's the thing that a lot of people are missing out of this equation. I've seen a lot of people put DarkZero down at, like, number 2 or 3 in terms of the power rankings. I've kept them at number 1 in my power rankings because you still have Zamudo, who, by the way, was Zamudo in this series, especially on the Gwen in game number 1. You still have Spyrax, who I think has been awesome across this year, and Sajed and Zyko are still maybe the best bot lane in the entire league. It's not like you're losing out elsewhere on the map. Like, Shimmer might have some more ups and downs in the jungle, but you've got the best players in your role in most other positions. You're not super worried about the consistency of this roster, and I think we saw that here. Sajed's actually going to be getting my player of the series. Not that that should surprise anybody. That Senna in game number 2 is really what he's getting this for. I like Senna as a pro pick. I think especially in, the playoffs, when games traditionally are going to go a bit longer, where teams are going to be less prone to making big, like, game-flipping decisions early on. I think you can get that scaling a lot more consistently, and I think especially if you're going into something like Kalista, you can neutralize a lot of what Kalista wants to do in the early game and then just completely outscale that champion and become so much more relevant as the game continues to go along. That's exactly what Sajed did. Jhin wasn't exactly the main character in game number 1, but it still was a pretty good Jhin game, all things considered, from Sajed, and I think he's been better this year than he was last year on FlyQuest, and I know that that might not be the most popular opinion in the world. I think he's just getting a lot more responsibility put on him on DarkZero than he did on Fly last year, where of all the 5 players on that team, he felt like the one that was kind of being guided along the most. He didn't really have a ton of responsibility. He just had to show up to late game team fights. Here, he actually does have to do quite a bit more, I think, in terms of generating his own leads, and he's doing a good job at being able to do that. So that's obviously fantastic. How do you not pull out Zamudo here? Like, this guy was my all-pro pick for top lane, even though he didn't play for parts of the split because they were swapping in between, DarkZero Storm and DarkZero Light. Like, Zamudo didn't even play the entire split, and to me, he still was by far the best top laner in the entire league. That just goes to show where I think this guy is at right now. He has decimated this level. Like, it is very clear that he is ready for tier 1, and I'm excited to see if he ever gets that opportunity. Maybe it will be on this organization if they end up getting promoted, but he made that matchup not particularly close into Hoarder. Not only was game 1 a big slaughter in his favor, the Gwen did fantastically into the Mbessa, but also, like, the Jace was destroyed over and over again for Hoarder on the other side in game number 2 when he was playing the Scion, just purely because of the amount of pressure he was able to generate. Like I said, Shimmer was good. Spyrax is super consistent in the mid lane. He's kind of like Pobelter. I think it's honestly a pretty apt comparison. I don't think they're the same play style. Like, Pobelter wants to play for team fights a bit more because he is more of a control mage player, and Spyrax is probably the best shove and roam mid that we have in tier 2, and, obviously those are different styles, but the consistency and just the stability that they bring to the mid lane I think is very comparable, and Zyko to me is still the best support in tier 2. I know that there are a lot of people that are going to bring up other names. I would take Zyko over any of them. I really do think he's that good, and so I think the rumors of DarkZero's demise have been greatly exaggerated, and they proved that here. And then for Conviction on the other side, this is a good team, and they did keep up with DarkZero for quite a bit. They just didn't have the firepower to come over the top with a lot of the pressure they needed here. Hoarder is going to get dead of the series for me on the top side. This was a very easy choice. He kind of got bodied by Zamudo in game 1, and then he was quite bad on the Jace in game number 2, ends up going, like, I think it was like 5-13 or something in that game. It really is not the final game of a series that you are looking for when things are going down to the wire. It's also pretty difficult to play Jace if this game continues to go as long as it does, but I like Hoarder. I think he's been the best of the rest in terms of the top laners coming into this split. Like, you can make an argument he's been a top 3 or a top 4 top laner. It's him, it's like TF Blade, Crimson, Denethor. Like, they're the ones that are fighting it out for that spot, but Hoarder has been super impressive in his own individual role. It just didn't quite happen here today because everybody has been losing to Zamudo. I also think it's worth pointing out that some of the more aggressive plays coming in from players like Manui did not end up working out in this series. The Alistair game in game number 1, I think really kind of stood out for not being particularly strong from Manui. Not entirely his fault, but certainly something worth noting. Chrome was way too far forward in a lot of instances, but at the end of the day, he was trying to do damage, and that's his job. And then, of course, you've got, players like Darkwings, players like Kizno that are really solid in that same vein. So for Conviction, it's all really just about keeping your mental on you. I think that that's the best way I can put it, is just not getting tilted from a series where you kind of got blasted. I wouldn't say blasted. You stayed in it. You stayed relevant and competitive. You just weren't able to take a game. You move down now to the lower part of the bracket. Depending on who ends up losing in the series that we're going to cover next, it kind of, determines where they're going to land in terms of, getting into round 3 or just going down into lower round 2. I think the more likely option here is them going into round 3 because they'd be the higher seed of the 2 teams that would lose here, and that would be big for Conviction. I still think there's a chance that this is a top 3 team, and they're going to get a chance to prove that because of their placing right now in the playoffs, but they definitely need to play a little bit better than this if they want to compete for top 2, which may or may not be realistic. And then for DarkZero on the other side, I think this team is still undervalued. I still think they are the team to beat in the NACL, regardless of if they have UG or not. UG is the player that pushed them over the top, but this team is still phenomenal everywhere else on the map, and I think they showcased that here today. But then moving on to our second of the round 2 series and our final series to cover in today's video. It's a matchup between Luminosity Gaming and Winthrop University, 2 versus 6. And Luminosity is going to pick up the 2-0 victory. So both of our round 1 series end up going 2-1. Both of our round 2 series end up going 2-0. And that sets up the bracket pretty nicely moving forward. Not that there is any real surprise by how things went in either of these series, but credit to Luminosity for showing up here today. This was the most dominant win of this first weekend for them. Game 2 was a little bit more back and forth. Winthrop did a good job in the back half of that game of trying to pull something back, but with no gold on the Azir, it becomes a lot more difficult for them to ever team fight, really at any opportunity, and unfortunately that meant that they ended up falling, and Luminosity was pretty consistent throughout this series, so I'm excited to go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Tactical in the bot lane. I've been super high on what Tactical has been doing across this entire split. I think that there have been multiple great options for who the best AD carry in the NACL is. I think Sajed has actually put up a really great argument for DarkZero, but to me, Tactical continues to reign supreme, and that's another take that I had at the beginning of the year that I think has been justified pretty nicely. This guy has been mega elo trapped on Immortals the past couple of years. He has his pluses, he has his minuses as a player, but when he is able to get leads and when he's able to generate his own advantages, he absolutely decimates games, and that's what we continue to see, and that's why things like Misfortune and Caitlyn make a lot of sense for him individually as a player. If he can start snowballing early in a lot of these games, all of a sudden the mid game becomes so much easier for Luminosity to end up playing out. I will say though, one of the most impressive things when it comes to Tactical across this split for me has been his flexibility, his ability to play basically anything they need in the bot lane. Typically he's only really been like a main character type of player, a primary option, a strong side bot laner, whatever you want to call that role. And I don't think he's needed to be that across 2025, which I think is a really good sign. Hopefully he can translate that into something that maybe could get him back into tier 1 at some point. This was a really great series, and mobility, especially on the other side, has been in really good form. So to see Tactical come out and just be the best player on the Rift and be, super fed and really take over a lot of these games, I think is a really good sign. But it was everybody on the side of Luminosity. Give credit to Zeyzal. He was excellent towards the back end of the regular season. I've been up and down, I would say, on Zeyzal across his time over the past couple of years, both in tier 1 and in tier 2. But this has been a really good stretch for him, and I think him and Tactical are starting to really develop some nice synergy and chemistry together, playing these lanes that can be a little bit scarier, like the Misfortune Shen or like the Caitlyn Braum, of course, in game number 2. Insanity was really great on the Hui in particular in game 2. I think that was the game that really stood out for me. I haven't talked about Insanity all that much this split. I think some people, might maybe disagree with me when I say this, but I think he's been good for this team, but he's certainly not been like the guy for Luminosity. I expected a bit more dominance out of him because he is such an interesting player with an interesting play style. I expected that to kind of come through more back in tier 2. It's not necessarily been the case. I think almost everybody else has kind of shined a bit more than Insanity has so far in 2025, but when he wins, he still wins incredibly hard. And Sword's been very consistent on the other side. For him to kind of decimate that matchup in game 2, especially on a champion that I think is pretty weak right now in the Hui, I think is a very good sign. Fake God ended up getting Broadcast's player of the series. I very much disagree with that. I understand that it's probably built off of like KDA or something, but Denethor ends up really outplaying him, quite frankly, in game number 1 on the Camille, his signature Camille pick on the other side. Fake God was super good on the Rumble in game number 2, and that's, I think, where he builds a lot of that reputation for player of the series, but I certainly think he was much more up and down this series than maybe just like outright dominant. I'm going to give Denethor a lot of credit when we get to Winthrop, and then Tomio was solid. This guy's actually been really good for this team team. Again, another player that I made an all-pro in my all-pro selection. So shout out to Luminosity, really nice clean 2-0, and they were probably the most dominant team here in the first weekend, which is a good sign. And then for Winthrop, this team still is good. Like, they still are able to fight back from more negative situations. I think we did kind of see that here. Unfortunately, they just didn't quite have the talent to be able to beat Luminosity. The only team to be able to do that is DarkZero, who had UG at the time. So that's definitely an interesting conversation that we will save for the bracket. But for Winthrop, dud of the series for me is going to go to Sword in the mid lane. The Azir in particular in game 2 just really did not hit. He did not have a particularly good game, and especially when they're trying to come back and you're relying a ton on Ashe damage and on Poppy and Gnar to set things up, and you have nothing coming in from the Azir, it becomes a lot more difficult for you to win a lot of these late game team fights, and I think Winthrop kind of showcased that, unfortunately, in this one. Sword has been really good across this year. I would argue he's been an upper half mid laner around number 5 in the league, which is much better than maybe I was expecting coming into this split, but didn't necessarily translate here. Really the first series where it felt like Insanity mega gapped his opponent. Not to say he has been losing. Again, I don't want it to be misconstrued that I think Insanity's been bad, but this is like one of the first times where I've been like, oh, the enemy mid laner just kind of got destroyed by Insanity in this one, especially in that second game. I think that there are some negatives to point out for players like Wilson in terms of how he played out the mid game of a lot of these games, especially game 2 on the Poppy, where he just kind of allowed Luminosity to take whatever they wanted on the map, and then, I think there are some positives as well. Denethor, I thought, was much better than his KDA would indicate on the top side of the map, specifically on the Camille. In game number 1, a champion he's been very successful on throughout his time in tier 2. I thought mobility and only 35 were fine, but again, this kind of goes back to the point I've said multiple times about Winthrop. If this bot lane's not winning, if they're not actively generating advantages for the team, it's hard for Winthrop to win games. They rely so much on that bot lane 2v2, very similar to what we talked about for CCG, where if it's not clicking, if it's not working, even if they're good but they're not the better bot lane, things can get kind of dicey pretty quickly for this roster, and I think we saw that here. They're going to be fine. They're moving down into the lower part of the bracket. Of course, they are a round ahead of Near Airport and CCG. Whoever wins that will take on Winthrop because it's the gauntlet, and a Conviction is after that in the round after that. So round 3, Winthrop's in round 2. We'll explain it when we go over the bracket, but Winthrop still in a position where they can get an upper tier standing. They're not eliminated just yet. Everybody's got an extra life going into the playoffs here, but Winthrop has utilized theirs, and we'll see if they can keep their momentum from round 1. And for Luminosity, now the question becomes, can they be the number 1 team in the NACL? It feels like a really big top 2 right now in terms of the standings, in terms of the power rankings, and I think they only cemented that with this victory. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL playoffs, upper bracket, round number 1 and round number 2 overview and analysis here in the spring split. We're going to update the bracket that you can see up on the screen now, a little bit fancier than it was when we previewed it at the end of the regular season, but a couple of things have been confirmed. Of course, DarkZero and Luminosity are in winners finals. They're going to be fighting it out to see who is immediately going to qualify for finals. I don't believe that is next weekend. I believe it's the weekend after. I believe we're moving down to the lower part of the bracket, which you can see with the 4 teams that did not pick up, permanent victories in the upper bracket that had to utilize their extra lives. First off, of course, CCG taking on Near Airport in that lower bracket round number 1 matchup because they lost in round number 1. I think the most interesting matchup there is of course, Spica versus Dardoch, 2 players that have played against each other quite a bit and have actually played together, I believe, on the same org. Somebody might correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that Dardoch was the starting jungler when Spica ended up getting promoted to TSM. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. That could be entirely off base. It could have been Mike Young for all I remember, but I believe that is the case, and that could be a really fun matchup. Of course, Dardoch versus Pobelter, Dardoch versus Doublelift, a lot of interesting conversations there, and even other matchups. Array versus Doublelift I think is very interesting. So we'll see what happens with Near Airport considering their expectations, but then winner of that takes on Winthrop, winner of that takes on Conviction. As you can see, it's a gauntlet style format in the lower bracket to get to finals, so you definitely didn't want to blow your extra life early, but now you still have the opportunity to get your confidence back and get a ton of momentum as you go through the lower part of the bracket. My prediction is that Near Airport will be able to run the lower part of the bracket. They will beat CCG, they will beat Winthrop, and they will beat Conviction, although I think Conviction will stand the biggest challenge. And then for DarkZero versus Luminosity, I'll just preview that now, even if it's not happening next weekend. I still think DarkZero is the team to beat right now in the NACL. Remember, DarkZero beat Luminosity. That was with UG, and so there definitely is a little bit of a, okay, well, can you do it, without UG? But I don't know, man. I just really believe in this DarkZero team, and you have to remember, as a group, and this applies to playoffs now as well, Zamudo, Spyrax, Sajed, and Zyko have yet to lose a game this year. Like, not a series. Like, they've obviously yet to lose a series as a group. They have not lost a game. They've 2-0'd every single series that they have played as a unit so far in 2025. This team has been unstoppable, and I think they will continue that, even with Shimmer. But let me know if you agree or disagree with my takes there down in the comment section below. Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions down there, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of the NACL playoffs all throughout the month on this channel, but we cover all 4 of the major regions as well, so LTA North, LEC, LCK, and LPL every single week. We're getting into the playoffs and a lot of them as well, so very excited to start covering that. If you're interested, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all